Hello, welcome everybody to this third class on personal economics. Today we continue on the topic of motivating employees by talking about money, cold hard cash, but also on how money is not the only thing that motivates employees. So we're going to talk about monetary incentives, but also about non-monetary incentives and reciprocity. Remember, humankind is no Homo economicus, but is more of a Homo reciprocans. Today's lecture corresponds to chapters 8, 9, and 10 of Kuhn. Please note that we will also be discussing a video by Dan Pink. This video is integrally part of the course, and you can find the video on the new Personal Economics YouTube channel. Now, so far, we have largely remained theoretically. We have discussed assumption of personal economics, discussed problems and solutions to the principal-agent problem. Today we're going to go more into the real world, see more experiments and also more practical applications. Among others, you'll understand by the end of this lecture that a little bit of money can be very motivating, but sometimes giving large amount of money to employees can also backfire. Also, that giving money to employees changes less than when you take money away from employees. So the benefits of giving are much smaller than the drawbacks of taking away. Finally, we will also talk about trust and fairness. They are not only morally important in an organization, but they also entail economic benefits for organizations. Let's return to last class. In last class, we discussed the principal-agent problem. Now, this problem originates from the separation of ownership and control. We also discussed this problem can be solved by means of employment contracts. These contracts offer principals two guns to shoot with. So one, base pay, so A, and incentive pay, or B. Now, one of the things we said then was that base pay does not motivate employees towards higher performance, while incentive pay does. Now, having digested this, some of you might think, okay, but show us the proof, where's the hard evidence? Well, a classic study that empirically demonstrates the motivated value of incentive pay is the one by Lazier from 2000. Now, this experiment is taught in almost all personal economic courses. Remember, Lazier, the man with the creepy smile, is the founding father of personal economics. What Lazier did is he conducted a study at Safelite Auto Glass, which is one of the largest auto repair shops in the US, so auto glass repair shops better. You can think of them as the American car glass. What basically happened at Safelite was a transition from a fixed hourly wage to a piece rate system. So they went from a fixed A to a variable B. In the beforehand scenario, employees were paid $20 an hour for 8 hours of work, so basically a 9-to-5 job. The only thing they had to do is they had to fix at least 3 windshields from different cars. So A was 8 times 20, so $660 a day. After the transition, employees earned $32 per windshield. Now, to ensure that the quality would remain high after this transition, so avoid that employees would do lousy and very fast replacements, Safelite took into account customer complaints. So if customers complained they had done a bad job, an employee would have to make repairs in his or her own time. And to ensure that the employees had some kind of financial safety, they would still be paid according to the old scheme if their income fell below $160. So that is what they would have made in a day under the old scheme. Now, what was the result of this transition? Now, before the transition, so the scenario with the fixed A, they saw employees fixed on average 3 windshields. So they met minimum requirements. They were not bothered to do more. They were also not incentivized to do more. Now, after the transition, what they saw is a difference in performance. They saw a split of employees in a low and a high performing group. So on the one hand were employees that were still doing the basic requirements. Of course, they could fall back on the old scheme. On the other hand, we have a group of employees that replaced 44% more windshields. But two other interesting things happened as well. First, there was a short-term increase in costs, so plus 7%. This is, of course, wages and materials for the high-performing groups. If they replace more windshields, if you give them more per windshields, you have to pay them more. So short-term increase in costs. But what I saw over the longer term is that low-performing employees left the organization. There was voluntary turnover. They were replaced in turn by high-performing employees, which then resulted in financial benefits over long term. So what can we actually learn from this very simple case study? It's that what we call PPPs, or performance pay plans in short, plans with a variable B, in other words, they not only stimulate employees' performances, but they also make it easier to attract and retain high-performing employees. So changing a compensation scheme can change the kind of employees that you attract in your organization. There is a kind of selection effect that occurs here. In human resource management terms, we could attribute this to person-organization fit, literally the fit between an employee and the values or policies of the organization. In other words, small innovations in human resource management, they do not only affect motivation, but also the productivity of employees and ultimately the composition of the workforce. Note that this is also without large changes in the production process, which would have cost money to the organization, and with employees being better off. So both employees and organizations were better off, so creating a kind of balanced approach. However, of course, we should also remain critical. Of course, that PPPs were successful here does not mean that they are successful necessarily in every organization. Remember from your HR course, there is something in HR like best fit. So the best HR practice is the one that's best tailored to the context. Also remember the effort misallocation problems from class 2. If one task is more incentivized, employees tend to allocate their efforts towards the more incentivized task. However, at Safelite, there were a couple of success factors that avoided effort misallocation from occurring. First is that they had data on employee productivity, and also that employees worked independently. So this means not only that all performance was visible, but that it could also be ascribed to one single employee. So they know who is doing what. Second success factor is the customer feedback. So this discouraged employees from allocating their efforts to replacing as much as possible, regardless of quality, to replacing as much as possible in a qualitative way. Now, of course, in practice, issues like labor laws, so restriction on work hours, for example, and the difficulty of detangling performance due to its multidimensionality might prohibit monetary incentives from being effective in most organizations. Also take into account that employees that are paid according to their performance, they need work available. Employees in the Safelite example, they will make less if there is no steady flow of broken windscreens coming in. So therefore, it's safe to conclude that PPPs are not suited for the majority of organizations and employees. Now, another experiment that demonstrates that performance-related pay, so variable B, stimulates performance, but not in all cases, is the experiment by Gnisi and Rusticini. Now, this experiment was performed on 160 students at the University of Haifa in Israel. These students had to do a kind of university admission tests, like the GMAT, the General Management Admission Tests, the test you typically take for admission to a business school. This test consisted of 50 questions. Students received money for providing correct answers on this test, so based on their test score. So students were divided in 4 groups. All students received 60 shekels to participate. So shekels, abbreviated as NIS, is the currency of Israel. 60 shekels, that corresponds roughly to about 15 to 16 euros. So the 16 shekels, this is A. They get it anyway, regardless of performance, and this was also the same for all groups. What differed between the groups was the reward for a correct answer. This varied from 0, so no financial incentives at all, to 3 shekels per answer. And the results are displayed in the table on the slides. So similar to Lazier, we see that financial incentives, or variable B, they improve performance. With no rewards, students had an average of 28.4 answers correct. When paid 1 shekel and 3 shekel per answer, this rose to 30.1 and 30.7%. Notice there is indeed a small drop going from 1 to 3. This is probably because the students were already performing at their intellectual capacity, so they were already doing their best, they couldn't do more. However, we see something very interesting happening here as well, and that is when we pay students a mere 0.1 shekel per correct answer, they performed worse than under no financial incentives. So in economic terms, performance was higher under 0 marginal incentives than when there were low incentives provided. In other words, if you are an employer, pay enough or don't pay at all. And I could also illustrate this with 2 real-life examples from my network about eating together with colleagues, so an annual colleague dinner. Now, in one hospital that I know of, employees got free fries, but they had to pay for any additional extras, such as sauce, snacks, drinks. And this mere fact made employees very angry. Their perception was, okay, either you give us the full package, or either you give us nothing at all. Now compare this situation to a logistic firm where they hold an annual barbecue, but all employees are asked to pitch in 15 euros each. Even though employees need to pay for this event, they're very happy with this yearly event occurring. In other words, it's better to consider offering employees enough incentives, or employees will feel offended, and those incentives are likely to backfire. So indeed, from these simple experiments, it should be clear by now that performance pay, or variable B, can motivate employees, but that this is not a universal law. This is also highlighted in the TED Talk by Dan Pink. Now, Dan Pink is a motivational speaker, and he's also the author of the famous book Drive on Human Motivation. Normally in class we would watch and discuss his video together. Now you can find it on the YouTube channel. In his talk, Pink points to another limitation of performance-related pay, that is the type of task. In an experiment he describes, participants had to solve a puzzle on how to attach a candle to a wall. Now what happened when financial incentives were introduced? Participants performed worse. So financial incentives, they concluded, might be less suited for complex tasks than for simple tasks. And that's also why we see a lot of financial incentives in jobs where task and performance are more straightforward. Another thing that Pink stresses is that organizations often design HR policies without really paying attention to existing empirical evidence, so no evidence-based management. The result of that is that we find pay for performance also in jobs that are less suited for such incentive schemes, which results in higher chances for effort misallocation problems. Now in summary, what does Lazier, Gnizia, Rusticini, and Pink learn us about monetary incentives and motivation? Now, monetary incentives stimulate employees' job performance, but first, you have to pay them enough or incentives will backfire. 2, there are also natural limits to employees' performance. So that is what we saw in the Gnizia experiments. Difference between 1 and 3 shekels was very small because the researchers attributed this to students already performing at their peak level. And finally, incentives are not suited for every task, implying also not for every job or not for every organization. Now, knowing the limits of monetary incentives leads, of course, to the logical question, is there more to motivation than money? And the logical answer is, well, of course there is. In fact, there are more or less 4 types of motivation, 4 motivational bases that can also stimulate employees towards higher performance without money being involved. Now that is public service motivation as a type of pro-social motivation, intrinsic motivation, symbolic motivation, and finally image motivation. And there is also experimental evidence to support the force of these motivational bases. To illustrate, we'll have a look at another experiment, namely by O'Reilly. Now, O'Reilly did an experiment where participants they had to assemble Lego figurines, and they received $2 per figurine. But this decreased by 11 cents per figurine. So they started with $2 for the first, this turned into $1.89 for the next, and so on and so on. Participants were divided in two groups, and they could stay as long in the experiment as they wanted. Now, one group was subjected to the meaningful condition. This group completed figures, and afterwards they were put when they were completed in a row or lineup before them, so they could see, so they could admire their finished work. The other group was subjected to the Sisyphus condition. This condition is named after Sisyphus, so from a figure from Greek mythology, and he was punished by the gods and had to push a heavy rock upon a hill, only to see it fall back and have to push it up back the hill again for eternity, on and on and on. Now, participants in the Sisyphus condition, they had their figurines destroyed when they were ready. So they made a figurine, they handed it back to the experimental leader, who disassembled it and put it back in the box. Now, why did they observe participants in the meaningful condition? They made on average 3 figurines more than participants in the Sisyphus condition. So a difference of 10.6 versus 7.2. In other words, adding meaning to employees' work has a sizable effect on how much employees are willing to do for the same wage. Because remember, in this particular experiment, financial compensation was the same for the two groups. So it was concluded that participants in these experiments were intrinsically motivated, so motivated by the task itself, by seeing the fruits of the labor before them, which induced a higher performance. What is actually more, organizations are well aware of the power of intrinsic motivation. And that is why organizations come up with all kinds of mission statements and mottos. They do so in the hope that employees will internalize them, so it will stimulate intrinsic motivation. Tesla wants to transition to a sustainable world, so a potential Tesla employee might be motivated to work for this organization because in that way he or she is contributing to a sustainable future. Our own university, Tilburg University, wants to understand society as its motto. So I might be motivated to work for Tilburg University exactly because I like to address societal problems and enigmas, stimulating my intrinsic motivation. Another tool that organizations use to motivate employees without spending money is through symbolic awards. Now, what's typically for these kind of awards is that they have no or little monetary value. They derive their value from public recognition. That is to say, basically they are worthless, they only have value as long as other employees recognize or believe it as value. Of course, once employees start to make fun of it, it loses its value, of course. Now, the advantage of symbolic awards is that it does provide implicit information about performance. For example, to future bosses, if you put on your resume that you were Employee of the Month in the past. But the drawback of symbolic awards is that it often involves making performance public. Think, for example, about sales results, which are put on a whiteboard in the office for everybody to see. When performance is public, employees start to compare themselves to one another, so social comparison effects start to occur. Result of such a comparison is that less performing employees typically start to perform less. And the reason why this happens is to maintain the belief in their own abilities. If I know I can't be the best, I won't do my best, and I can still tell myself, well, I wasn't really trying anyway. This is something you typically say to your brother or your sister when you're playing a game together and you're about to lose. In other words, symbolic awards can weaken the weakest and thus increase the dispersion or spread of performance between employees in an organization. A motivational base that is not included in the book, but is important for HR and especially HR in public sector, is public service motivation, or PSM. This type of motivation tries to explain why some people work for government or public services, like nursing, police, civil services. These are not always attractive workplaces in the first place. Think about nurses and police, they have terrible hours, while civil service is also not really a gold mine. But why do employees work for this type of organizations? Typically because they want to do good for society. So public service motivation, or PSM, refers to employees' motivation for public service, which is rooted in a desire to serve society. Another motivation base is image motivation. This refers to doing a task or job because it's one, visible, and two, seen as socially desirable. Now, working as a nurse might be socially good and desirable, but is not necessarily visible to others. So a key distinguishing element with public service motivation is here the visible element. Why does Trump visit the troops? Because it's the right thing to do, and there is cameras. Why does Rutte, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, ride the bike to work? Same reason, being seen, doing good. Now, illustration of image motivation in the workplace is, for example, that employees start to work harder when the boss is watching or present. An experiment that nicely illustrates this is another one by Aureli. So this is the same researcher from the Legos. This time he did it with two colleagues, Braga and Meyer, which is abbreviated on slide and in the book as ABM. Now, they invested donations to the Red Cross among 161 graduates at Princeton, so fancy students, Ivy League students. What the participants had to do, they had to press the X and Y button on their keyboard for up to 5 minutes. So X, Y, X, Y, X, Y, X, Y, X, Y. And if they did, they would donate a couple of cents to charity. Now, there were 4 conditions based on whether participants were themselves rewarded for the donation or not, or whether the results were public or not. Okay, these results show 2 important things about motivation. Now, the first thing is that participants donate way more when people are watching than when people are not watching. So a difference of 900 versus 517. Second, while this remains the case while employees are rewarded, we also see that adding monetary incentives reduces, or as we call, crowds out image motivation. So it falls from 900 to 840. In other words, doing something good for money is no longer a signal to others that you are a good person. So you are less motivated to perform in this scenario. So in sum, intrinsic motivation refers to doing a task simply because you enjoy doing it. Symbolic rewards, they motivate because they provide a sense of information. And image motivation works because it's visible and signals to others that you are a socially good performer, while public service motivation is doing something good without it necessarily being visible to others. Now, the existence of these motivational bases is important, but monetary rewards can also reduce their effectiveness. For example, in the Gnisi experiments, rewarding students for the test scores, this might also have taken away a bit of the satisfaction or rewards of the students doing good on the test. The Red Cross experiment by IBM, rewarding the employees for making donations, reduced the donations they made, so reduced a bit of satisfaction they derived out of making a donation. However, some of you might also wonder, okay, but all these experiments, they deal with really small amounts of cash. This does not really reflect a workplace where there's typically more money involved, and people would also pay more attention to the economics involved. And if this is how you're thinking, you're right. So one of the biggest critiques of past experiments is that with small rewards, people might deal much less rationally or much less rational agents than they would with larger rewards. And to imagine this principle, think about a poker game with friends. So if you play for a couple of cents among friends, your behavior is typically less rational. Say you are more likely to do stupid stuff like go all in than when you would play for a larger amount of money, but you pay more attention to your chips. Now, our good friend there really took this criticism at heart, and in a decision that, okay, in my view, raises some serious ethical concerns, he did not increase the rewards, which would be the logical step to do, but he said, oh, okay, I'm going to go to a rural village in India where small rewards are simply worth more to people. Okay, makes sense in a bizarre kind of way. Now, the experiment consisted of letting people in the village do a series of board games corresponding to different types of tasks. So creative tasks, memory, physical tasks, all different type of games. And participants were assigned to 3 conditions. So either they would get low rewards, medium rewards, or high rewards. Now for the highest rewards, they would get 400 rupees. Now 400 rupees, this corresponds to about 4.8 euros or 1 monthly wage in the village. In other words, if they had a high performance for all tasks, and there were 6 of them in total, they would get about a half a year's income. So there were large financial stakes at play. Imagine getting half a year's income for free. Now, what do the results show? These are displayed in the following figure. So figure A in the top left corner, this is the average for all the 6 games combined. We see here performance is slightly higher in the medium rewards condition compared to the low rewards condition. But the difference is pretty small. But what do we see? Performance dramatically increases in the high rewards scenario. What is going on there? Well, first we know from Dan Ping that financial rewards do not always work that well for simple tasks. So this might be a partial explanation since it are relatively simple tasks. However, this is not what happened. What happened is what we call a choke response. So when financial rewards are high, people become nervous, they overthink. They display what we in psychology call involuntary arousal. They start to become overly focused on the tasks, and this inhibits them from performing well. Underlying this choke response is a distinction between motivation on the one hand and performance on the other hand. Now, in traditional economic theory, motivation and performance are generally considered as the same thing. However, if you think about it, I can be motivated to become the #1 ice skater in the Netherlands, but that necessarily won't increase performance, won't necessarily make me a better skater. And this is also the reason why we study the link between well-being and performance in human resource management, because we know motivation, as an indicator of employees' well-being, correlates, but is not necessarily causally related to performance. But are large stakes really always a problem? Are they counterproductive in all jobs? No, that will also be too fast a conclusion. Think about it this year. So incentive schemes, they attracted people that performed well under those particular incentive schemes. So there was a kind of selection effect involved. Similarly, it might be the case that high stakes attract people that are more attracted to this kind of stakes, that perform better under these kind of incentives. And a fun study in this regard is one by Coates et al. In 2009. They found that men with a shorter index finger tended to self-select themselves in more risky jobs, like stockbrokers. And what is the reason behind this? The reason behind this is the shortness of the index finger is an indicator of your hormonal exposure during pregnancy. So the shortness of men's index finger is associated with a higher risk preference, better visual scanning, but also better reflexes. So better response to rewards, high rewards, and having a lower choke response. Good to know, it's also associated with doing better on competitive sports, the number of sexual partners you have, but unfortunately also with baldness. So if you're looking at your index finger right now, you know what's coming for you. Long story short, the large prevalence of short index fingers among stockbrokers in a study by Coates offers some kind of indication that a selection effect is occurring in jobs with larger financial stakes. Now, if we reflect on our journey so far, we've started from a really economic transaction model with one agent and one principal in class 1 and 2. Well, now we are gradually inserting more insights from psychology and sociology, giving more empirical evidence, so making the transition from a real Homo economicus to a more Homo reciprocans. And through this complex reality of incentives is also partly reflected in contemporary employment contracts. In exchange for effort, employees not only get financial incentives, they also get promotion, fringe benefits, they get to enjoy company culture, and so on. So an employment contract is actually about employees reciprocating efforts for a broad rewards base. To study employees' reciprocal behavior, personal economics draw a lot on gift exchange games. This sounds a bit complicated, but it's actually really simple. Basically entails that a principal gives money and the agent decides how much effort to supply, so by giving money back. For example, say I pay 5 euros as a principal, you decide as an agent to give me 3 euros back, which reflects your effort. So I have 3 now and you have 2, so we have more or less divided it equally. So basically, experiments about exchanging money. One favorite exchange game is one by Fair et al. So the experiment went as I described before. A principal was offering a wage and an agent would respond by sending money back. There were 3 different contracts and principals could also choose which contract they would use. The first contract that was there was a trust contract. So the principal offered a wage and asked to return the same effort, but had no real means to enforce it. So he could just only rely on trust. But he could also choose for a bonus contract. In a bonus contract, principals could offer a bonus if agents returned the same effort. Finally, there was also an incentive contract, so this was the reverse of the bonus. Here the principals could give agents a fine if their efforts were not returned. Now, what do the results show? While both principals and agents were better off under bonus contracts, so they would get a higher wages, they would also get a higher efforts, and employees worked quite okay under trust contracts, so employees would also reciprocate under just trust contracts if the principal had no means of enforcing the exchange relations. Still, principals preferred incentive contracts, so they wanted more control, while it was not necessarily in their financial benefit. Now, why does this occur? It's because bonus contracts, they work better because they save on monitoring costs. Principals do not have to check on employees or they do not have to punish employees. Through the bonus, employees are automatically incentivized to reciprocate. Second, the incentive contracts, they worked worse because they also signal a kind of distrust in a way that the principal or employee does not trust the worker when he gives a fine afterwards. So meaning that agent would not have wanted to reciprocate with that principal again. Then why did principals still prefer incentive contracts? This might have to do with the short nature of the interactions in the experiment. So there was not really time for trust to develop. Okay, simple experiment, but what does it learn us? It learns that contracts without financial incentives, so only with a fixed A, without a variable B, they might work better in the context of long-term employment. So where there's some kind of trust that has been built up and organizations do not have to constantly check on employees' efforts. So it shows in a way there is an economic advantage to trust. When employees and organizations trust each other, can result in financial benefits. But why do employees reciprocate in the first place? To answer that question, Theo Offerman from the University of Amsterdam, he did an experiment called the hot response game. In this experiment, participants exchanged coins, so guilders, the old school Dutch money, before the euro. In this experiment, there were 2 rounds. In the first round, the principal acted. Now, the principal had 2 choices. Either he could be helpful. He could be helpful by adding 4 coins to the agent, and as a reward, he would get 8 himself. Alternatively, he could be hurtful, so he could take away 4 coins of the agent. This would gain him 11 coins for himself. This type of situation was designed to mimic the cutting or raising of wages among employees by employers. Now, in the second round, the agent got the opportunity to act. The agent got three choices. Either he could reward the principal. This would give 4 coins to the principal and would get the agent 9 for himself. Alternatively, he could punish the principal, so he could take away 4 coins for the principal. This would gain him 9 coins for himself. Or he could also decide to be cool about it. So in this case, he would get 10 coins with no change to the principal. And of these 3 options, cool is most rational because it gets a larger financial gain. It gives you 10 coins as an agent instead of 9 coins. Now, Theo Offerman also wanted to test if it mattered whether people reacted not only to the outcomes of such exchange games, but also the underlying intention. So that's why he introduced a dice condition. In this dice condition, the principles were helpful or hurtful just based on fate. So just by rolling a dice unintentional. Now, what do the results show? The results showed that agents or employees almost always rewarded helpful principles and punished hurtful principles. But this pattern was much stronger for the intentional condition, so for the real principles of flesh and blood. So this means employees are not only motivated by fair outcomes within organizations, that is what employees do, hurting or helping, but they're also motivated by the intentions of the employer, so why they actually do it, whether they hurt intentionally or reward intentionally or not. But what is more, negative reciprocity was much stronger than positive reciprocity, meaning employees were more likely to punish a hurtful principal than they were likely to reward a helpful principal. And this difference was quite large, so about 16.7% of helpful principles were rewarded, while about 83.3% of hurtful principles were punished by the employees. So an astonishingly large difference. In other words, hurting hurts more than helping helps. This is also something we see in real life. So employees, they react more fiercely to wage cuts and reduced benefits than they would to increases in wages and benefits. Also, increases in wages and benefits, they have much shorter beneficial effects. This means that wage increases do not automatically pay for themselves. If you give some extra money to an employee, they might perform better for a short time, but afterwards they will get used to it. There are 2 explanations for this fact. First is the biological explanation. This says that the brain is more sensitive to negative information because it has it has a higher survival value. So that's why we pay more attention to negative information. It's more important to know where the bear is than where the berries are, for example. Second is hedonic adaptation. A hedonic adaptation says that people have some kind of standard point of happiness. So you have a standard level of happiness, and after a changing condition, we return to this normal level. So we get used to a certain standard of living. Getting more money does not necessarily make us more happy. So this is, let's say, the ultimate proof that money does not make people happy. If they get more money, they get used to it, in a sense, and it loses its beneficial effect after a certain time. Now, past experiments show that employees are motivated by both trust in relationships and also in fairness in relationships, but also that it has economic value, so it gives better financial outcomes for both parties. On the other hand, attempting to control employees, this might have hidden costs, so this might backfire. And this is also nicely illustrated in a very simple experiment by Falk and Kosfeld from 2006. In this experiment, agents could again choose their effort level, expressed in dollars. So they could choose how many dollars to give out from 120 game dollars that they get. The amount they give to the principal would be doubled in value to the principal. So for example, if I was an agent and I would pitch in $5, means this value will be doubled. The principal would get $10 out of this exchange. The only thing the principal could choose was whether or not to impose a minimum effort level. For example, the principal could say, well, the agent has to give at least $5. Expectation was rational agents, they would choose the minimum level. So they will always choose 1 or 0, or the level set by the principal. And fair agents, they would choose to break even. So choose the value that both agents and principals will get the same amount of money. But what happened? They actually found out that agents give a lot more when there was no minimum level. So this runs counter to the idea of a rational agent who would always give the minimum amount of money. This is not true. Agents were willing to give more. But when there was a minimum level set by the principal, there was a tendency to choose exactly this level. So this runs counter to the fair agents who would choose to split the money equally. This is not true. The agents gave less. So in sum, the agents gave more than the rational agents, but they gave less than the fair agents. Now, in real-life terms, suppose I work at Safelite Auto Glass. Now, in a day, I might fix, let's say, 5 to 6 windshields in a day. But when my boss comes to me and tells me, well, you have to do at least 3, there will be a kind of tendency to reallocate my efforts around 3 windshields. That is to do the minimum requirements when such a minimum level is specified. This is also something we see in organizations that often specifying such a minimum level, they do so in an effort to control employees. But trying to do this backfires because it induces employees to do the minimum expected, and in the end, the organization ends up losing money. So the lesson for firms here is don't micromanage employees' performance. Doing so can lead to a kind of cycle of coercive surveillance. This is something we see with camera surveillance among employees. So placing cameras in the workplace, they're typically viewed as very intrusive by employees. So employees often, when they are confronted with camera surveillance, they try to find a way around the cameras. For example, they go lunch or they deal with clients where the cameras are not present. Of course, this kind of behavior typically makes the organization distrust employees more. And the organization typically reacts by placing more cameras. So they engage in a vicious cycle of controlling and pissing off employees. So the cycle of coercive surveillance. But what about other employees? Remember in class 2 we said that one of the assumptions of simple principal-agent model was that of a single agent. In reality, we know there are multiple agents, there are multiple employees in the organizations. So what employees consider fair will also be determined by what other employees do, or more importantly, what other employees earn. To make sure pay is fair, a lot of organizations, they invest in internal pay scales. Typically, these pay scales, they attribute pay to jobs more or less on an objective basis. So often based on the position or the level of the function and based on tenure. And this avoids that organizational employees, they have to constantly renegotiate wages. So avoid that the principal-agent problem has to be solved over and over again. Now, some organizations, they place their internal pay scales online. They make it transparent. This is something especially that government organizations do for reason of transparency, because of course you're paid with tax money. You want to know how much people earn working for the Dutch government. Well, you can simply look that up. The link is there below. But there are also companies like Glassdoor. They put the pay scales of other organizations online. Now, going to Glassdoor, so here I've given the example of Amazon. This can be interesting, for example, when you're applying for a job. I want to know how much the job actually would earn you. Now, a main question that such internal pay scales create is, of course, whether or not they should be visible. This is something that Card et al. Studied in a study and also the final experiment for a day. So they did an experiment among employees of the University of California. They have a very nice campus, as you can also see on the picture right there. They wanted to assess what effect does knowledge of co-workers' salaries have on your own job satisfaction and intention to remain in the job. So what they did was they asked questions about job satisfaction and turnover intention, so intention to switch jobs, and they divided employees in two groups. So one group, they got a mail with a link to the internal pay scales beforehand, and the other group, the control group, did not. What did they observe? So below median earners, people who earned less than the average of the participant group, they were less satisfied. They were more inclined to indicate that they wanted to switch jobs, so they had lower job satisfaction and higher turnover intentions. But for above median earners, so people who earned more than the average of the participant group, there was no effect in job satisfaction or turnover whatsoever. So their average satisfaction level and intention level remained the same. And this fits with the idea of hedonic adaptation that we saw earlier. So the high group, the high paid group, was unaffected. It also relates to the fact that people are more responsive to losses than gains. This is something we call loss aversion. People typically want to avoid losses in their daily life, loss of resources. So what does this learn us about making internal pay scales public? Well, it might be good, of course, for reasons of ethics or for transparency, but when doing so, you also have to account for emotional reactions that making internal pay scales public can create, like people becoming less satisfied or leaving the organization. So, in fact, the empirical evidence is more in favor of wage secrecy. And on that bombshell, let's head to today's takeaways. We saw a lot today, so what have we learned? First of all, small rewards in experiments, they can have a large effect on performance. That is, of course, as long as you don't pay employees peanuts, because very small rewards, of course, they can also backfire. Same can be said for large rewards. Giving too much rewards, giving very large rewards, they can lead to choke responses and undermine performance. We also saw that employees have a much broader motivation based on money. They can be motivated by more things, like the enjoyment of the task, their image to others, helping society, or by trust and fairness. This is something that organizations, of course, should take into account. Another thing organizations should take into account is that employees are more sensitive to losses than gains. So employees react more fiercely when you take something away than they react positively when you give them something extra. This is something we should account for when designing HRM policies. Finally, is that trust and also fairness, they have an economic advantage. It's not good to over-control or micromanage employees, because this could result in not only distrust from employees, but also performance loss and financial loss for the organization. And of course, employees also want to be treated fairly, so they want to be paid on an objective basis, for example, through an internal pay scale. While on the other hand, this does not necessarily mean that this pay scale has to be transparent. So they want objectivity, they do not necessarily long for full transparency. Okay, let's reflect a bit on potential exam questions I could ask. A favorite question of mine are about comparisons, so similarities of difference between, for example, the different forms of motivation, different experiments. I compare Lazier with Gnisi, for example. Another thing I could do is ask a case, for example, an organization similar to Survive Autoglass undergoing transition from fixed pay to variable pay, describe what is going on, and explain what personal economics would expect would happen in this kind of situation. So these are potential exam questions I could ask about this chapter. Now, next week, we're going to talk about selection, so be ready for that one. For questions, I will be available on the chat this Friday, so during the normal course hours. If you have any other questions, you can, of course, still mail me. This being said, stay healthy, stay safe, and see you next week. Thanks.